5,000 years ago, the first herders arrived in the Rift Valley. 3,000 years ago, a second wave came down from the Ethiopian highlands. 2,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking farmers pushed east from the Congo Basin. And every single one of those peoples, including one that history forgot, still lives inside the DNA of a single Maasai person standing under the East African sun today. This is not mythology. This is not oral tradition being dressed up as science. This is the result of real published DNA studies. Studies that sequenced the genomes of living Maasai people, extracted ancient DNA from East African skeletons thousands of years old, and then compared the two. What they found was a genetic record so clear, so layered, and so precise that scientists could literally watch the history of East Africa unfold, chromosome by chromosome, base pair by base pair. And at the center of that record are the Maasai, a people who carry inside their cells the genetic ghost of a vanished civilization. The Maasai are not a famous genetic case study in the way of, say, the descendants of Genghis Khan or the Ashkenazi Jewish population or the Polynesian voyagers. But they should be. Because when researchers ran the numbers, when they sequenced the chromosomes of Maasai individuals in Kenya and compared those chromosomes to ancient genomes pulled from archaeological sites across Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Sudan, they found something remarkable. The Maasai are not a single people in genetic terms. They are a living composite, a biological archive of three major human expansions, one of which left almost no trace in history books, no surviving language, no identifiable pottery tradition, and no name that anthropologists agree on. That third group is now called the ancient East African herders, and they vanished as a distinct people 3,000 years ago. But their genes did not vanish. Their genes are sitting inside the Maasai right now. Roughly 1/5 of the entire Maasai genome comes from people who, by every measure we have, should have disappeared forever. Let me walk you through the waves. Wave 1, 5,000 years ago, the first herders. Before we get to the waves, though, we need to establish who the Maasai are today, because if you don't understand the present, the past won't land the way it should. The Maasai are an ethnic group of roughly 1.5 million people living in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. They speak Ma, a Nilotic language belonging to the Nilo-Saharan language family. And that language family detail matters more than you might think. Most of the people surrounding the Maasai in East Africa speak Bantu languages. The Maasai do not. Their language ties them not to the Bantu expansion that reshaped most of Africa south of the equator, but to peoples far to the north, to the ancestral populations of the Nile Valley. That linguistic clue alone told anthropologists decades ago that the Maasai's story was not a simple one. But language only hints. DNA spells it out. The Maasai are traditionally semi-nomadic cattle pastoralists. Their entire culture, their social structure, their religious worldview, their economy, everything orbits cattle. A man's wealth is measured in the size of his herd. Cattle are currency, cattle are status. Cattle are the medium through which a man pays bride price. Cattle are the source of milk and blood upon which Maasai families have traditionally subsisted. The phrase that keeps coming up in anthropological descriptions of the Maasai is that the cattle is the wealth. And this is not poetic metaphor. This is literal economic and social reality. A Maasai elder without cattle is a man without standing, without voice, without future. A Maasai family without a herd is a family on the edge of collapse. And here is where the DNA enters the story in a way that you cannot make up. The Maasai drink cow's blood. This is one of the most famous cultural practices of the Maasai, and for good reason. It's striking to anyone from outside the culture. At certain ceremonies and in times of nutritional need, a Maasai warrior will draw blood from the jugular vein of a live cow, mix that blood with milk, often in a calabash, and drink it. Blood mixed with milk. That is a protein load, a nutrient density, that would absolutely wreck the digestive system of most humans on Earth. But the Maasai can handle it. Not because they've trained their stomachs, not because they've built up a tolerance over a lifetime, but because their DNA carries a specific genetic variant, a mutation that lets their bodies digest milk and milk products into adulthood, a trait called lactase persistence. And the variant they carry is not the European variant. It is not the variant widespread across Sweden or Finland or the Netherlands, the one tied to the spread of cattle herding across ancient Europe. It's not even the variant carried by the Fulani of West Africa, who also live in a pastoralist culture. The Maasai carry LP1409G, an East African specific lactase persistence allele, at a frequency of roughly 40%. 40% of Maasai carry a digestive adaptation that evolved independently, right here in East Africa, around 5,000 years ago, as cattle herding spread southward from the Horn of Africa. Think about what that means. 5,000 years ago, somewhere in the Horn of Africa, a human being was born with a mutation that allowed them to continue producing the enzyme lactase past childhood. In a world where fresh water was often contaminated, where calories were precious, where milk was a renewable resource that walking with cattle provided every single day, that mutation was a superpower. Individuals carrying that mutation survived. They reproduced. They had more children who survived to reproductive age. The mutation spread through the pastoralist populations of the Horn. And then, as those pastoralists began to move south, the mutation moved with them. It crossed into the Rift Valley. It swept through the populations that would one day become the Maasai. And today, 40% of Maasai carry it. 4 in 10 people. If you are Maasai and you drink milk without any digestive discomfort well into adulthood, you have your ancestors, and this mutation, to thank for that. The independent evolution of lactase persistence in East Africa is one of the clearest examples of convergent evolution in the human genome. The same problem, how do you consume milk past childhood, was solved in Europe, solved in East Africa, solved separately in the Sahel, solved separately again in Arabia. Different mutations, same result. And each one of those mutations acts as a genetic timestamp. It tells researchers exactly when pastoralism, the full-blown cattle economy, arrived in each region. For East Africa, that timestamp is roughly 5,000 years ago. Wave 1 had arrived. Now we need to talk about what those first herders looked like, genetically. Because this is where the ancient DNA comes in. And this is where we start to see the ghost in the genome. In 2019, a team of researchers led by Mary Prendergast published a landmark paper in Science. The study sequenced the genomes of 41 ancient human skeletons recovered from archaeological sites scattered across Kenya and Tanzania. These were skeletons from the period between roughly 5,000 and a few hundred years ago. Skeletons that covered the entire span of the pastoralist and farming transitions in East Africa. And what the team found when they sequenced those ancient bones was a pattern that no one had fully predicted. The first herders, the people who brought cattle into East Africa around 3000 BCE, were not the ancestors of today's Maasai, not directly, not exclusively. They were a distinct population that the researchers now call the ancient East African herders, and their closest living relatives are not in Kenya at all. Their closest genetic affinities are with populations from the Horn of Africa, particularly from the highlands of Ethiopia and the regions around the Upper Nile of Sudan. These were Cushitic-speaking people, almost certainly, pastoralists who had mastered cattle, sheep, and goat herding on the savannas and highlands of the Horn, and who then, 5,000 years ago, began to push south. Think about what that migration must have looked like. No roads, no maps, no written language, just a people, their herds, and a landscape that changed as they moved. The Horn of Africa is dry, high, and dominated by savanna and highland plateau. As those first herders moved south, they followed the grasslands, they followed the rain. They crossed into what is now southern Ethiopia, then northern Kenya, and then the Rift Valley, the same Rift Valley that today is Maasai heartland. And they did not find an empty landscape. East Africa was already inhabited, and had been for tens of thousands of years. There were hunter-gatherers there, populations with deep roots in the region going back to the earliest dispersals of Homo sapiens out of East Africa. Those hunter-gatherers are now largely gone. Their genetic signature survives only as faint traces in the genomes of later populations, including the Maasai. But in the ancient DNA, they show up clearly, a distinct substrate beneath the later waves. So Wave 1, ancient East African herders, Cushitic-speaking pastoralists from the Horn, arrive around 3000 BCE with cattle, sheep, goats, and the LP1409G lactase persistence allele. They spread through the Rift Valley. They establish a new way of life in a landscape that had previously supported only hunter-gatherers. For a long time, for the duration of what archaeologists call the pastoral Neolithic, they are the dominant population of East Africa. And then, 3,000 years ago, Wave 2 arrived. This is where the title of this video comes from. The people that vanished 3,000 years ago. But we need to be precise about what vanished and what survived, because the story is more eerie and more beautiful than a simple disappearance. Around 3,000 years ago, a second wave of herders came down from the north. These were not the same people as the first wave. They were Nilotic speakers, the ancestors of the people today called the Southern Nilotes, the language group that includes the Maasai and their immediate linguistic relatives. They came from the Upper Nile, the region of present-day South Sudan and the borders of Ethiopia, and they brought with them a different language, a slightly different material culture, and a different genetic profile. They were taller. Their Y chromosomes were dominated by the A3B2 lineage, the classic Nilotic marker, which traces its deepest roots to the eastern Sahel and the southern Nile Valley. They were cattle people, like the first wave, but they were not the same people. In the DNA, the arrival of Wave 2 shows up as a massive genetic shift. Prior to 3,000 years ago, the skeletons in East Kenya and Tanzania look Cushitic. They cluster with Horn of Africa populations. After 3,000 years ago, that signal begins to shift. Nilotic ancestry begins to rise. The two populations meet, mix, and, over centuries, the Nilotic component becomes dominant. By the time we get to the populations that live in the Rift Valley today, the Maasai genome is roughly 60 to 65% Nilotic, roughly 20 to 25% Cushitic, and the remainder, a mix of Bantu and deep hunter-gatherer ancestry. The Cushitic pastoralists, the ancient East African herders, did not vanish. They were absorbed. And this is the part that gave me chills when I first read the papers. The ancient East African herders have no living language, no living pottery tradition, no surviving name. Their culture, as a distinct entity, is gone. The linguistic evidence tells us that their language, probably a branch of Cushitic, was completely replaced by Nilotic tongues throughout the Rift Valley. Their material culture faded into the archaeological record, successive pottery styles blending and shifting until the original Cushitic styles were no longer distinguishable. By every measure of cultural survival, these people vanished 3,000 years ago. History. The history we can reconstruct from language, from archaeology, from ethnography, has no record of them. A person walking through the Rift Valley today would never know they existed, but the DNA knows. The DNA never forgot. When researchers in the Wankumhang study in 2013 ran a chromosome-wide analysis of Maasai and Kikuyu populations in Kenya, they found exactly what the ancient DNA would later confirm. The Maasai genome carries a substantial component, roughly 1/5, that is not Nilotic, not Bantu, not hunter-gatherer. It is Cushitic. It is the genetic signature of the ancient East African herders. Roughly 20 to 25% of the Maasai genome belongs to people whose language has been dead for 3,000 years, whose culture has no modern continuity, and whose name we will never know. This is what the title of this video is about. Scientists ran a DNA test on the Maasai. They found a gene from a people that vanished 3,000 years ago. And that gene, that entire suite of genes, is not rare. It is not a fluke. It is present in every Maasai individual tested. 1/5 of the genome, 1 in 5 ancestors. Walking around inside every Maasai person alive today is the genetic material of a people that no one remembers. And here is the irony. Those vanished people may have given the Maasai one of their most famous adaptations. The LP140009G lactase persistence allele, the milk digestion gene, was not originally Nilotic. It was already present in the ancient East African herders when they arrived 5,000 years ago. The very trait that defines the Maasai's pastoralist economy, the ability to consume milk into adulthood, appears to have been inherited from the people they absorbed. The blood and milk ceremonies, the entire dairy-based economy, the biological foundation upon which the cattle culture stands, it comes from the ghost population. The Maasai don't just carry the genes of the vanished herders. They carry the adaptation that makes their way of life possible. Wave 2 then, Nilotic herders arrive around 1000 BCE. They encounter the descendants of the ancient East African herders. They mix. The Nilotic language and social structure win out. The Ma language today is Nilotic, not Cushitic, but the genetic exchange is profound. The resulting population is a hybrid, and that hybrid population then continues to evolve in the Rift Valley, selecting for the traits that make the Maasai what they are today. Which brings us to the height. The Maasai are among the tallest people on Earth. The average adult Maasai male stands around 1.85 meters, 6 foot 1. In many populations around the world, 6 foot 1 is the beginning of tall. Among the Maasai, it is the average. And this is not a modern nutritional accident. This is the result of natural selection acting on a population adapted to a specific environment. The savanna is hot. The sun is brutal. The primary mechanism the human body has for cooling itself in high heat is the ratio of surface area to body mass. The more skin surface you have relative to the volume of your body, the more efficiently you can shed heat. Long, elongated limbs maximize that surface area. And in a landscape where daytime temperatures routinely exceed 35 degrees Celsius, where water is scarce, where walking long distances with cattle is a daily reality, the selective advantage of an elongated body plan is large. Generation after generation, the tallest, lankiest individuals survived the heat just a little better, lost less water, maintained core body temperature just a little more efficiently, and had just a little more energy left for survival and reproduction. Over 3,000 years of pastoralist life in the Rift Valley, natural selection sculpted a body plan that is now among the most distinctive in the human species. But the height is not just Nilotic. The Nilotic ancestors were already tall. Populations of the Upper Nile are among the tallest in Africa, and the genetic component that contributes to height in the Maasai comes substantially from that Nilotic ancestry. The Cushitic component added its own signal. The combination, plus selection for thermoregulation in the savanna environment, produced the Maasai body type. Once again, the layers compound. Wave 1 gave the milk gene. Wave 2 gave the Nilotic language and the A3B2Y chromosome and much of the height. Selection in the Rift Valley fine-tuned the result into what we see today. Now, before we talk about Wave 3, I want to spend a moment on the maternal lineages, because they tell a story that the paternal lines do not, and the difference between the two is one of the most underappreciated aspects of this entire genetic history. The Y chromosome of the Maasai is dominated by A3B2, the Nilotic marker passed from father to son. That is clear, unambiguous, and it tells the story of the Wave 2 expansion. But the mitochondrial DNA, the DNA passed from mother to daughter, is a different picture entirely. The mtDNA of the Maasai is primarily L2 and L3, the deep African lineages that have been present in East Africa since before the emergence of Homo sapiens as a species. But there is also a component of M1, and this is where it gets strange. M1 is a rare maternal lineage. It is found in East Africa, in the Horn, and in the Arabian Peninsula. It is not common anywhere. And in the ancient DNA literature, M1 appears to represent a backflow out of Asia, a lineage that originated in the Middle East or South Asia, moved into Egypt or Arabia in deep antiquity, crossed the Red Sea, and entered the Horn of Africa. The presence of M1 in Maasai mitochondrial DNA means that, thousands of years ago, female ancestors of the Maasai carried a lineage that had traveled from somewhere in Western or Southern Asia, through the ancient Near East, down into Egypt or the Arabian Peninsula, across the Red Sea, and into the Horn, and then, eventually, southward with the pastoralist expansion into the Rift Valley. That is a very long journey. That is a journey that spans continents, spans millennia, and spans the full history of human dispersals out of Africa and back again. And it is preserved in the mtDNA of Maasai women today. The point of all this, the reason I'm telling you about Y chromosomes and mtDNA and lactase alleles and height, is that the Maasai are not one thing. They are not a single ancestral population that stayed put and evolved in isolation. They are a living record of the entire human history of East Africa. Every major migration that touched this region in the last 5,000 years left a signature inside the Maasai genome. And when you put all those signatures together, you get a picture of a people who are simultaneously ancient and composite. A people whose biology documents their history with a precision that no written record could match. Wave 3, 2,000 years ago. The Bantu. Around 2000 BCE, in the highlands of what is now the Nigeria-Cameroon border region, a population began to expand. They spoke languages from the Bantu family, and their expansion would become the largest demographic event in recent African history. Over the next 3,000 years, Bantu-speaking farmers moved east and south, spreading across the Congo Basin, crossing into East Africa, and eventually reaching as far as South Africa. They carried ironworking, new agricultural techniques, and a genetic signature that would become the dominant component across most of sub-Saharan Africa. When the Bantu expansion reached East Africa, it encountered the Nilotic herders who were already established in the Rift Valley. And the two populations did not simply clash, they mixed. The modern Maasai genome contains roughly 10 to 15% Bantu ancestry, not dominant but clearly present. The Maasai are predominantly a Nilotic pastoralist people with Cushitic admixture, but they also carry a small but significant Bantu component. The Bantu wave, the most recent wave, is the lightest layer in the Maasai genome, but it is there. The Bantu expansion that reshaped most of Africa did not pass the Maasai by. And that, in the end, is the full picture. 5,000 years ago, Cushitic herders from the Horn carried cattle and the lactase persistence allele into the Rift Valley. 3,000 years ago, Nilotic herders from the Upper Nile moved south, absorbed the Cushitic herders, and established the language and social structure that became the Maasai. 2,000 years ago, Bantu farmers arrived from the west and left a minor but detectable genetic signature. And the entire time, the hunter-gatherer populations that had inhabited the region for tens of thousands of years left their trace in the deepest layer of all. The Maasai genome, in other words, is a stratigraphy. Each layer corresponds to a wave. Each wave corresponds to a specific date. And each date corresponds to a specific migration that archaeologists and geneticists and linguists have independently confirmed. The genome is a clock, and the genome never forgets. I want to end by focusing on the ghost one more time, because it's the part of this story that I can't stop thinking about. The ancient East African herders. They had a language. They had parents who gave them names. They had songs, presumably, and prayers and jokes and stories about the stars. They painted pottery. They buried their dead with care. They built a world in the Rift Valley, and for 2,000 years, from roughly 3000 BCE to 1000 BCE, that world was the dominant human reality of East Africa. And then another people came, and the first people did not disappear, but their world did. Their language went silent. Their pottery traditions fused and faded. Their names were forgotten. Within a few centuries of the Nilotic arrival, the ancient East African herders, as a distinct people, ceased to exist. No one remembers them. No surviving oral tradition mentions them. No linguistic trace of their speech has survived in the Rift Valley. The historical record contains exactly 0 references to them. And yet, whenever a Maasai mother gives birth, the child that she holds carries inside its cells the mitochondrial DNA of her lineage, a lineage that may run back through the L2 or L3 or M1 branches into the deep past. That child carries the LP140009G allele, passed down through 5,000 years of ancestors, and if the child is male, he carries the A3B2Y chromosome of the Nilotic herders. He carries Bantu ancestry from the farmers who came west. He carries hunter-gatherer ancestry from the people who were in East Africa before any herder set foot there. And he carries, deeply, profoundly, roughly 1/5 of his entire genome from a people whose name no one knows, a people who vanished 3,000 years ago, a people who survive only inside the bodies of the Maasai walking the Rift Valley today. That is not a metaphor. That is a measured, published, peer-reviewed result. When the researchers sequenced the Maasai genome, they found a component that matches no modern population, that matches no surviving ethnic group, but that matches, in precise statistical detail, the ancient skeletons pulled from the earth at pastoral Neolithic sites across Kenya and Tanzania. The ancient East African herders are not a speculative reconstruction. The DNA test shows that. The gene is there, the people are there, they never really went away. Every wave left its mark. Every mark is still there. That is what the DNA shows. If you want more layered histories like this, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.